Accessible, efficient, reliable and affordable transport networks are a vital ingredient for growth. And for too long, the transport networks of the North have suffered from far less investment than compared to, say, London and the South East. Politicians of all parties have promised that change is coming, and whilst there have been some projects of note, the transformational change is still awaited. The Northern Powerhouse Partnership was launched in 2016 to be the leading voice of business and civic leaders in the North. Its vision is simple. By closely connecting the great cities of the North, we can create a whole that is greater than the sum of our parts. The Northern Powerhouse Partnership's CEO is Henri Murison, and I met with Henri in the dramatic surroundings of the National Railway Museum in York. We chatted about the challenges facing the North and how transport investment will play a critical role in addressing them. Henri, it's great to be here in really one of the most iconic railway locations we've got in the country, in the National Railway Museum in York, very much part of the arc that is the sort of Northern Powerhouse. Just give us a bit of a context. How did you end up at Northern Powerhouse? What was sort of your journey to this point?
So my background was firstly in the public sector. I was in local government. I was a councillor up in the northeast of England for a few years after university. And then I went to work in the private sector for a while in financial services. And while I was doing that, kept on an interest in transport policy. I've been very interested in transport when I was up in the northeast. And particularly worked on, because the business I worked for, Yorkshire Building Society, had a big presence in Bradford, worked on the case for a new station there as part of Northern Powerhouse Rail. So still had an interest in this world. And then when this job came up, obviously applied for it, thought this sounded like a really important opportunity for the business community to be able to put its views forward about what the future of the North's economy should look like. And importantly, to build real collaboration, not just with government, but with local leaders here across the north of England. And that consistent view, that ability to make some of those tough choices about prioritisation is never easy, but absolutely is the spirit of the original Northern Powerhouse project that very much was about saying, yes, government might spend some money in the north of England, but most importantly, it will transfer powers and decision making. And over time, the north will take more and more responsibility for its own economic destiny. Right. And along with that comes its transport networks, whether that be bus or rail.
Okay, well, we'll absolutely come on to that because that's one of the areas I really want to focus on. But you said something interesting. You said very much putting forward the business point of view. Is Northern Powerhouse then very much a sort of a business-led, business-driven advocacy, or is it more than that?
So we've always tried to have a positive dialogue with the public sector. We've got council leaders from Bradford, from the East Riding, from Manchester on our board.
Yeah.
But the majority of our board members, our members are all private businesses. And many of them are not directly involved in transport. Many of them are the businesses like Bruntwood, for example, who develop office and lab space, not just in the north, but in the Midlands, in London, now at Imperial, who require transport for their businesses to be able to work, who are the beneficiaries, right, of a well-connected transport system. And my reflection would be that, of course, our mayors are getting more organised. They'll be launching in the coming weeks something called the Great North, which is about them putting their view as elected leaders to government. But it's perfectly legitimate and appropriate that the private sector has its own views. Sometimes those will be the same as our elected leaders, but sometimes we will have different priorities and different emphasis on what needs to be done first. And in particular, the private sector does have a role itself in investing in projects that it thinks are of particular importance. Yeah. And I think, as has been proved for many years, first with what was London First, now Business London, there is a very strong link between delivering big projects like Crossrail and having business-led advocacy to help make the case for them. Because particularly those mega projects are never entirely going to be the public sector's domain.
Absolutely not. And again, we'll come on to financing, I guess, where the private sector's got a big role to play. So one of the things I was thinking, well, given that the metro mayors, combined authorities will be getting a bigger role, more powers devolved, does that mean a sort of a change in role for Northern Powerhouse? I guess you might say, no, actually, if anything, it's even more important in order to put that business view across.
And some of the time, we're not just lobbying government. Sometimes we need to be telling local authorities, now metro mayors, what our local priorities might be and what the implications are of their decisions for the rest of the north of England. Because one of the things that is interesting about the business community is they tend to take a slightly broader view of what is important than often local political stakeholders can. Because we are often, in the case of many of my funders and the people who help set up the partnership, present in more than one part of the north, right? So if you're, for example, a business that is seeking to deliver growth across the north of England and benefits from that, you're going to have a slightly different perspective than a local authority or a combined authority that is just interested in one particular part of the country.
Yeah.
And I think that more nuanced view of what the North's kind of collective needs are often does come from the business community, because they often don't see the world through the lens of local government or combined authority boundaries, but through economic geography. And those economic geographies are much broader than the political geographies we currently have in this country.
Let's just talk a bit about then the plan for devolution. It's something that's been talked about for an awful long time, but now seems to really be happening, and really be happening with some pace. Do the sort of local authorities, the combined authorities, the mayoral bodies, do we have the infrastructure in place to be able to, I suppose, to be able to deal with this? Have they been quietly developing over the years? So when devolution comes, we're up and running.
What's interesting is when George Osborne outlined that kind of first Northern Powerhouse vision now over a decade ago, standing in another building owned by this museums group in the museum in Manchester in front of infrastructure that obviously has a similar age and heritage to this, right? And I think my reflection would be that of all the things that Osborne set out as important, transport and connectivity, the need to invest in significant opportunities to promote the North abroad, a number of other areas he said were important. One of them was devolution and control of lots of the levers for local economies being placed in the hands of their local civic leaders again, which again was what we did 100, 150 years ago. We just haven't done it necessarily consistently for the last few decades. Of all the things that did and didn't happen, obviously we haven't built a new railway line across the Pennines yet, but across the north of England, devolution is largely completed. So we now have a situation where on this side, the Pennines, by the beginning of May, every part of the north on this side will have got an elected mayor. It looks like in the northwest, Cheshire and Warrington, Cumbria, Lancashire aren't much further behind. So you've now got a system where this is now the universal way in which the north is governed. And no longer is Greater Manchester sort of an exception to a rule. What was the Greater Manchester exception has become the rule. All of the north now has similar structures to what Greater Manchester had a few years ago. They might not yet have the full suite of powers that Andy Burnham has got, or the single settlement funding, but in the spending review we will see other parts of the north of England getting that single settlement, which will allow them to make much more joined up decisions, and obviously the control of local transport networks, the ability to franchise buses, one of the most important powers that was given to combined authorities. And what comes next, how Great British Railways interacts with, for example, those integrated public transport systems, that is equally as important in terms of delivering genuine growth. Because if you think about ticketing, the great example is always the Oyster card, right? Just introducing that across London with no other infrastructure upgrades led to 10% more traffic on the tube. And obviously Peter Henry, now the rail minister, knows that story very well. He was party to it at the time. It's absolutely the case that you could achieve the same through achieving the type of join-up and integration across transport modes that London achieved when it introduced the first Oyster card.
It's always been a bit, maybe a bit of a cheeky thought of mine, though. Really, you know, does the Treasury particularly really buy into the notion of devolved spending? Because I've always felt, you know, yeah, we're happy for you to spend your own money until we actually want to control it. So how real do you think these settlements are? Because when it comes to transport's key, and yet those are big numbers.
I think what's interesting is that the Treasury also wants to see growth. And under Darren Jones, we've got the new National Infrastructure Service Transformation Authority, lots of architecture which is about ensuring that growth is at the centre of what the Treasury does, not just its more traditional job as an old-fashioned finance ministry, essentially managing purse strings rather than having anything more positive to think about doing. And I think my reflection would be, the mayoral model is a more effective way of spending public money. Central government is pretty unwieldy, it's very silo-driven, it doesn't achieve best value. And in an environment where you're trying to reorient public spending to focus it more on growth, I think the Treasury will start to see evidence that local decision making is leading to better and more impactful investment decisions that can be made just from the centre. I think the challenge is that when you do get to those really big projects, a mass transit scheme for West Yorkshire, and those projects which cross the political boundaries between combined authorities like Northern Powerhouse Rail does, you are reverting back to more traditional forms of decision making. And that's the limitation of the kind of George Osborne original ambition, was that city regions can only do so much. There is a limit physically and in terms of the scale of what they can currently manage. And that's partly because they don't raise a lot of taxes themselves, right? So the Treasury might be resistant to more spending being done locally and at a sort of city region level, but they're incredibly resistant to giving up control of tax levers. And until you've got real tax powers, you will still find that mayors essentially are managing within the tram line set for them by central government. The longer term vision has got to be to enable mayors to raise more of their money themselves. That's why we've looked very closely at forms of fiscal devolution. And not all of the UK has a subsidy as good as the Zone 1 and 2 fair income from the underground, which gives the Mayor of London a huge fighting fund, right, to be able to go and do other things in transport policy. If you don't have something as strong as that, or the business rates tools that have been used to fund Crossrail, and you don't have the confidence to levy those tools or enough of a tax base to raise them against, you're going to need access to other instruments, whether that be employers' national insurance, other pots that currently all flow back to central treasury, but which the whole notion of gain share, the idea that mayors get a share of money they can spend every year, unrestricted from central government, that was built on the idea that Greater Manchester wanted to keep the revenues that they directly generated from their own investments. Now, that was too complicated at the time for Treasury, so gain share was created as a sort of proxy measure. Well, we're going to get back to that debate eventually, because the gain share monies that are allocated are still a fraction of what the Treasury actually benefits when a mayor gets it right.
Because if there's one thing that the Treasury really, really hate, which is the thought of devolving tax-raising powers, hypothecation of tax is pretty close behind it, isn't it? Which is if you've got a sort of a source of money that can only be used for one particular thing. They like the general pot, so that they can...
I do like the general pot, and I think my sort of thinking about this is, I am not interested in devolution for its own sake. So I'm paid to represent the business community's interest. As much as I may or may not be a federalist by nature, I'm not paid to do that. I mean, there aren't any companies in this country who are in favour of federalism out of principle. The argument is it more efficient? And the problem at the moment is that if you are a metro mayor, for example, in West Yorkshire, are you genuinely making every decision focused on the economic upside? Or are you actually thinking about when you're going to get re-elected and what you're going to say to the voters? And that is my fear, that some mayors might be misguided by electoral interests over economic ones. Because what you want is a mayor that can genuinely see a line of sight from I make tough decisions today, and in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, my region, and if I'm going to be a long-standing mayor, me personally will see the benefit.
Why is that any different to national government?
Well, national politicians are never going to last 20 years. And my argument is that Richard Leese did in Manchester, so did Sir Howard Bernstein. So, and I look at those like Steve Rotherham across the other side of the Pennines. I don't see Steve going anywhere anytime soon. He was elected as one of the first metro mayors, the very first batch of people. I can't see Steve leaving Liverpool City region until it's measurably a more successful place. And that's exactly what we want to incentivise. But at the moment, Steve's doing that because Steve has himself prioritised economic growth of his region above short-term political interests. That takes a particularly sophisticated type of politician to make that trade-off on their own, with no financial or other incentives to make them do it. I think the Treasury could create a lot more Steve Rotherhams if it did what I'm suggesting, because it would align incentives and behaviours and get the outcomes that government actually wants. You can't have a growth mission if the only people who benefit from growth are the Treasury. Private business needs to benefit, and so do our local and regional governments, right?
Absolutely right. So let's just move to talk about rail more specifically then. So Northern Powerhouse, what's your vision for rail, maybe as part of a wider integrated transport model? That's fine. And does it differ, do you think, from any of the sort of metro mayors, or on this, are you all aligned?
So, I mean, in the beginning, obviously, we wanted smart ticketing across the north of England. That was in the original Cities Growth Commission that Jim O'Neill wrote before the phrase Northern Powerhouse had even been coined. And it has a terrible name, Noyster, but don't hold that against it as an idea.
That's right.
But Noyster's dead, right?
Yeah.
Now we have reduced our ambition to integration at the level of the city region.
Yeah.
And I think there are things that our metro mayors will do to make sure that you don't see the joins between those different systems.
Right.
And the people who actually want to commute across boundaries because they happen to find a job in Manchester and live in Bradford can easily do so. I think the macro vision is still that we want a transport system that allows the north of England to function as a single travel to work area. And that's quite an ambitious proposition, right? You want people to be able to commute from where I was this morning in Hull to Liverpool, for example.
Yeah.
Now, nobody today commutes from Hull to Liverpool. And maybe even when you improve the connectivity, not that many people would do it, but it would at least be an option that would be open to people. And if you compare, to take a sort of slightly more sort of currently imaginable journey, very few people really commute by rail from Leeds to Manchester every day. As someone who does it regularly, there are not many people often making that journey.
And why is that? Is that because you can't do it very easily, or because there isn't fundamentally that latent demand for it?
I think the numbers are there when you put on a decent service, they come back, right? And there are lots of people driving on the M62.
Yeah.
So there are many people who have to make that journey. They're just not doing it by rail.
Right.
And I think my argument would be the Northern Powerhouse rail proposition is still the right one, which is that says that you can connect people to more and more cities from where they live, and that will have an economic benefit because people will not just make those journeys, but they would, for example, stay in the north if they worked in the life sciences and take a job in Leeds, because they would know if their startup didn't work, they would also be able to get a job at a startup or a similar business in Manchester. At the moment, people who have a choice between moving to London and living here are disincentivised from living here because their options, particularly whether it be their first or their second job, are limited potentially in their immediate local area. And the opportunity to easily commute, even if it's only for a short time, to another northern city for another opportunity without having to move their lives or their families or anything else, just isn't there. So that concept that what we want is an outcome, I'm not interested in how much new line I get. I'm not really interested in exactly what its specification is. Many of the people watching this might consider that heresy. But my point is, I want an outcome. The outcome I want is that, and it's something that Colette Roche, who's now at Manchester United, who was at Manchester Airport when we first set up, used to describe as would a young person growing up in Sheffield consider an apprenticeship in Manchester? Would they even consider it?
Today, no.
Yeah, and now they would not. And they wouldn't have done 10 years ago.
No.
And maybe if you improve the connectivity in 10, 15, 20 years, they might. And that's the change. And can you make those opportunities, that world more open to people?
Because it is, I mean, the north is quite tribal. And I use that word sort of carefully. I'm from Lancashire, right? I have some friends from Yorkshire, you know.
Welcome. I mean, I hope they check your passport.
They did, yeah. No, the visa's valid. It's fine. No, but I mean, it's a serious point, though, isn't it? I mean, some of that will affect travel patterns. And I also wonder, you know, post-COVID, we know this on the railway network, and I'm just focusing on rail at the moment. It's changed. The mix has changed. Commuting traffic, particularly travel to work traffic, has altered. The work from home, the hybrid model, is now the one that dominates it. Has that caused you and others in the north to kind of rethink the Northern Powerhouse rail proposition in the light of those what appear structural changes?
I mean, the thing you've got to remember though is we've got a load of modal shift to go after, as well as generating new demand. So the challenge at the moment is there are people who might want to travel from here to Manchester or from Sheffield to Liverpool, but it's not viable for them to do so, so they just don't make those journeys and they don't take that job. So you can unlock it for those people. And there's also, remember, the people who work in labs, the people who work in lots of places that don't have the types of hybrid work that, for example, my colleagues and I have. Do you mean? So there's also an element of sometimes the people who work in jobs like mine can presuppose that everyone is like them, and that isn't always true. So you have to look at the world as it is, not as you perceive it to be.
Yeah.
And I think my reflection would be on the wider argument about this, which is that if you take the sort of the comparison of London, yes, maybe some of those 12-car trains from Brighton aren't quite as full as they used to be, but you can still commute from Brighton to London.
Yeah.
And the point is, you can't make some of these journeys in the north of England currently and do so reliably every day and live a life like that. And so I think there was a definite point to some of the debate around HS2, which was that a lot of people were very willing to use kind of changes in post-COVID working as a kind of logic for doing something they wanted to do anyway. I'm not entirely convinced that was ever really fair or reasonable. And I think if you look at what's happening to demand on the railway, demand has definitely changed, but there is still commuting markets. I think at certain times of the week, those markets aren't as strong. And I think on certain routes that used to generate lots of value to the railway that could be redistributed as subsidy to other parts of the network, that causes some financing issues for the railway. But I don't think it demonstrates that you don't need that connectivity. So even though every train leaving certain stations of an evening might not be full and standing anymore, I'm not sure that means that we don't need a railway. I think if you took the railway away, that the economic value of that wouldn't just be the lost ticket revenue. There'd be a lot of other value we'd lose as well.
Well, the good news is the people that cried heresy when you were saying you were only interested in outcomes, not new lines, they've now fallen in love with you again because you're talking about the value of the railway. You mentioned HS2. Before we get on to HS2, one of the centerpieces of the North strategy really was Northern Powerhouse Rail and that connectivity. One of the things that HS2 Phase 2 delivered was shared infrastructure that would enable that. We had Hugh Merriman on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he said, bearing in mind he was Minister for Rail and HS2, and I asked him, were you consulted? And he said, I was informed, which was a no. He wasn't consulted. I just still find that absolutely unbelievable. I mean, just take us back, if you can, without it being too painful, to that October time. What was going on then, and how did we get to that decision? Because it it certainly damaged Northern Powerhouse Rail, didn't it?
It did. And I mean, as much as I say I'm not here to argue for new lines for their own sake, the outcomes require you to build new infrastructure, right? And that's what the HS2 issue is that we had a hybrid bill that was tootling through Parliament to build all of Phase 2B. That is the absolute bedrock of the Northern Powerhouse Rail network. And you only need to look at a year ago, almost now, when the government reran the numbers for the business case for the section of line between Piccadilly and the airport to realise what it does to the business case when you take away a big chunk of the traffic that's going south and towards Birmingham. It makes it much harder to demonstrate the need for that new infrastructure. Despite the fact that those east-west benefits are still there, you're developing a market that doesn't already exist, and we know that from a business case perspective, the Treasury is very dubious about the benefits of that and ascribing economic value, as much as I would argue that they misunderstand the potential benefits. We are yet to change that dynamic in terms of how these things are appraised. So in terms of looking back, I think it's fair to say that when he got his spreadsheets out, the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had created in his own mind a sort of a logic that said that HS2 was a relatively unpopular project. Cancelling it as much as possible would be popular, because cancelling something unpopular is likely to be popular. And then he could promise lots of other things that may never happen, because a lot of them probably would never happen, but would make more people happy. So it was a political decision. It wasn't an economic or an engineering-based one. And I think the challenge is that the bit of HS2 we're still building is the bit we need the least. So that's why
I might sort of challenge that a bit.
I would challenge. Well, I would argue that the case for having a new line into London is a lot weaker when you don't have the bits of it that we're going to generate.
That I accept. So the bit that we've cancelled is the bit that really turbocharged it, but I still think we need the bit we've got. But anyway, okay, I'll buy that.
And I think but at a price per mile, we are building the most expensive bit, and it was always going to be the most expensive bit, and that was a foreseeable thing. And it's not like Northern leaders didn't caution against that strategy. Like Richard Leese, the now Baroness Judith Blake, were very clear that it should be built from the north towards the south and not the other way around. And they've been proved right, because what Rishi did, as well as being ill thought through from an engineering and a evidence economic perspective, also failed politically. So it was a political decision. Only this Prime Minister could have done this. He made a decision for purely political reasons, largely, and out of his own kind of personal prejudices, which were also mixed in there, but sort of shielded behind politics as a kind of defence for why he was doing it. But it was an unpopular decision because it made no one happy, because we're still going to be spending a huge proportion of the transport budget on a project that does divide opinion even amongst supporters of railways.
Yeah.
And we are not getting most of the benefits we were going to get from doing so. And what the kind of Sunak premiership did was unpick the assumptions which also had driven the whole rest of our planning for the railway. So why are we spending all this money between Scotland and Lancashire in Cumbria for the next few years? Because that was the bit of the West Coast Main Line that wasn't going to get rebuilt as part of HS2.
Yeah.
And if you reverse the clock back to when Sir John Armitt, now obviously involved in setting up NISTA, was back involved in that rail upgrade, do you mean we've been trying to build something that looks like phase 2A of HS2, the bit between Crewe and down to Handsacre Junction? Well, we've been trying to build something like that for the best part of 20 years. So this is not a new demand that we need this infrastructure. It's been there a long time. And it became part of HS2, and then it was cancelled from HS2 without any proper thoughts about what would need to replace it.
Yeah.
And if the Prime Minister had said to me and other Northern leaders, the former Prime Minister now, I should say, I want to cancel HS2 because it's too bloody expensive. I want to look at options north of Handsacre Junction. Can you work with me? Nobody would have objected to having that conversation in a managed way. And a sensible debate that said, we can change the specification. You would probably got to a similar outcome to the study which Arup and EY and the law firm Addleshaw Goddard's, Mace, Skanska and others did, which demonstrated absolutely there are cheaper ways to deliver many of the same benefits for the north of England and the Midlands that don't require building a railway exactly to the original specification.
No,
of
but
HS2.
even HS2 Light, the Midlands North West Railway Link, even that's a political thing because I suspect in the end, once we've got past whether we have it or not, things like slab track or gauge, all the things that railway people get excited about would actually, if you're going to build it, you might as well build it right. We'll all come back. We just need to get beyond the political decision of whether we're going to do it at all.
And I think that for me, that's an interesting debate, right? Which is that is HS2 inherently the wrong project in terms of specification, or is it just that we ran out of money? And I think there is an interesting debate for me that, as someone who was a long-time supporter of HS2, if the country is going to build a new railway line, the decision was we should build the best version of that we possibly could afford at the time. But the logic was not that we needed the fastest railway line in Europe or the world. It was that we needed a new line, particularly along the west coast of the country. And I think I'm probably a bit heretical in saying that I think that if you could make a good financial case for doing something, for example, because it's going to be cheaper, then you should. But if the ground conditions between Crewe and Manchester mean that for that section, you have to put in piling that's some of the most complicated engineering you can imagine, to allow slab track because there's a potential revenue saving over the lifetime of the railway, but a huge upfront financing cost to doing it. The point is the person who should decide that is whoever's doing the potential private funding and finance deal for that railway. And they should work out whether you do slab or ballast. So my starting point is I will pay for and buy the best railway we can afford. Yeah. And what we can afford is based on who's paying the bill and what the financial calculations are about the direct financial benefits of doing it, and most importantly, the indirect taxation benefits to the Treasury.
Okay, but you're back to outcomes again, because in the end, you don't care how it's done. You just want the outcome of it.
And I know lots of people do care, and I understand why they do.
No, but you're right to only care. The outcome is what matters. No, what is frustrating, I think, about the HS2 decision is, of all the bits that is arguably oven-ready more than anything else, it's phase 2A. It's the bit from Handsacre to Crewe. It has the most profound impact in terms of capacity, which is why we were doing the jolly thing in the first place. And as you rightly said, when he cancelled it, there's no plan B. So that's, we're back to that problem again. Just back to Northern Powerhouse Rail though. you've still got this challenge. We've now got the thing that Hugh Merriman is leading on behalf of Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham and others, obviously other civic leaders, which is the Liverpool Manchester Railway Board. Does that fix that problem, or is it really still the same debate, just seen through another lens?
So I think, the Northern Arc proposal, which is the idea that you improve connectivity from Liverpool and Manchester through to Leeds, is clearly Northern Powerhouse Rail in another name. I think the review that's being led by Lord David Blunkett into connectivity in Yorkshire will play a similar role in getting people to think beyond just their own individual boundaries. Does that make sense? Because the reality, and I alluded to it earlier, is that the rail network, once you get beyond the suburban network, is hard for devolution because it largely sits at a mezzanine tier. It's beyond the individual combined authority. There was a reason why, before Transport for the North came along as a new institution, that the Rail North Committee had existed long before it, and why that debate about the franchise that became the TransPennine and Northern franchises that were awarded to Arriva and First Group, that whole process of the North agreeing what its collective priorities were, setting some genuine constraints on the art of the possible, and having a reasonable conversation with government, that is the art form we need to get back to.
Yeah.
And I think it is worth saying that long before Metro mayors came along, local council leaders were pretty good at that. And we shouldn't forget, in this world of mayors and combined authorities, that mayors in each case are one member of each combined authority. The local authority leaders make up the rest of that, that setup. And local authority leaders are quite important, actually, because historically they've been the ones that have been the most collectively minded, actually, about transport policy. They haven't wanted just what's good for their area. If you look again at Richard Leese and Judith, they were absolutely focused on what was in the interests of their two cities. And it is undoubtedly the case that from both a Leeds and Manchester perspective, their growth is inexorably tied to each other. The success of those two cities will be massively influenced by each other, and Bradford looks to both of them and thinks, right, well, we're going to be in this dynamic between these two big cities. We're also a big city. How do we benefit from them becoming closer together? And that was where the original kind of proposition for a Bradford station, which is still going ahead, was so important, because you can look at that economic logic that says, ignore the Pennines, get big cities closer to each other in terms of travel to work, and a city like Bradford that currently isn't as performing as well as it could absolutely sees that as the opportunity of a lifetime.
Which, in fairness to Hugh Merriman, and we talked about the cancellation of HS2 and Network North, he was particularly, I think, well, I got the sense he had a somewhat similar view to Network North as me. Back of a fag packet doesn't really begin to describe it. But at least, things like Bradford were important, and then do need to continue. Can I just go back to something you said there about Richard Leese? And you'll know this. I genuinely don't. It's always been one of those big questions for me. He said that Richard Leese, I know the late Sir Howard Bernstein was exactly the same view. Should have started it in the north, HS2. Then it would have been politically more sellable. When I look at the ONS statistics, London and the South East, two separate regions, in the year ended 23, they were the only two fiscally positive parts of the country. Everywhere else is a fiscal deficit. And that's not meant as a snidey remark, it's just a kind of financial fact. It's just a fact. So if you believe in levelling up, surely that north-south, south-north, whichever way you want to do it, connectivity is absolutely vital. And therefore, whether you start in the north, whether you start in the south, you've got to create that spine for levelling up. Or is actually east-west just as important? Because my concern is you're connecting a fiscally deficit region with a fiscally deficit region and not getting the benefit of levelling up with a fiscally positive one.
And remember, the fiscal deficit stuff's fun, right? Because Leeds does quite well historically on fiscal deficits. In fact, for many years, Leeds City Council was fiscally positive.
And Manchester does very well on a per capita. But there's all sorts. I know.
But the irony of the Leeds statistic is that was partly the case because there was such low levels of capital spending in Leeds.
Okay.
So sometimes winning on that league table is false praise, right? Manchester probably would have done as well as Leeds if it hadn't been getting the tram and all that at the same time.
Okay.
And I think my sort of starting point for this debate is, if you were to look at the original Cities Growth Commission and what the government said a couple of weeks ago about this concept of a Liverpool to Hull growth corridor with neither investment in Liverpool nor Hull, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure, another time. But some investment in the middle, including where we're standing, which is absolutely welcome. You start from the position that says, why is the north of England underperforming? And where we began this conversation was the economic rationale of you need to raise productivity in the north of England, travel to work areas, and the ability of labour markets to provide the types and the pools of talent we need for our economy is fundamental. There are lots of opportunities in the north of England, but they're not accessible to everyone, right? And that market of people who can't get to some of those opportunities is not just doing a disservice to those individuals or their communities, it's also doing a disservice to people offering those opportunities who wonder, why don't more people want to come and do X or Y in my business? There are all these young people out there, why don't they want to come and work here? Or there's all these people who want to retrain, why won't they come and work for me? And it's like, well, because they can't get to insert name of town here. And I think I suppose my pitch would be, if HS2 had not started first, and you were starting entirely with a blank sheet of paper, economists like Jim O'Neill would say, East-West is probably more important because that's the thing that's currently so poorly served. And yes, the West Coast Main Line is going to be full soon, but it's not full yet.
No.
But that isn't the way this happened, right? We'd started HS2 first, and we built NPR as sort of the lintel of a fireplace sitting on the top of those two legs of HS2, one on the west and one on the east.
I like that analogy, that's good.
So first bit of the fireplace we demolished.
Yes, yes.
And Rishi had a part to play in that as well,
Yeah.
was the bit on the eastern leg.
Yeah.
And I think my view is that HS2 trains will come to cities in the northeast and Yorkshire. I mean, sending HS2 to Sheffield, for example, using conventional infrastructure largely, would seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
So a bit like the Manchester offer that Rishi Sunak made, which I don't think was really thought through, I would argue there's a more thought through version of that offer about how you parcel out the capacity on HS2 beyond Birmingham to various parts of the country, and Sheffield will be a natural beneficiary of that, I think, in terms of its long-term destiny. And I don't think it would be that difficult to do. On the west of the country, I'm aware probably people in the northeast and others sort of go, oh, why are you so obsessed about that? Well, that is where the capacity is most constrained. So it's not that I love Manchester more than other parts of the north of England. I don't live there. I've never lived there. Before this job, I'd never worked there. But it's absolutely unarguable that the West Coast Main Line is the most congested piece of rail infrastructure in the country. There is no more space for anything. And there's a simple choice, right? Unfortunately, the consenting powers wouldn't allow you to do it. But you could probably build a road, right, up the land that's been assembled for HS2. You might need new powers. Or you can build a railway, but you have to build something because we need to move people and freight between the Midlands and the Northwest. Yeah. And at the moment, we have the M6 and we have a railway line that's full. Yeah. We're going to need more than those two things. And I would much rather choose a railway solution, which, by the way, will take a lot less land and be a lot less disruptive to people than a new road that would be of equivalent scale.
And I'm glad you mentioned freight, because we do tend to forget that sometimes in all these conversations. But phase 2A, the almost the Stafford bypass as it was 20 odd years ago during West Coast route modernisation, the one bit that didn't happen, I suppose, to my regret, really. The primary beneficiary of that is freight. But funnily enough, when freight benefits, the passenger railway benefits, because guess what happens? You start getting this, you can
attribute quite a lot of the economic issues with the current rail network of this country to it being a mixed network. So if speed is not the king, and I agree with that, which means journey time is probably not the king either. What are the things that really niggle at people? Why are people not choosing to make journeys, or why are they choosing to drive?
Yeah.
And reliability is a big part of that.
Yeah.
And we know that getting fast passenger trains off the West Coast Main Line onto a new line would massively improve reliability.
I agree.
It'd give you loads of more, if something does go wrong, loads more options.
And loads more redundancy. No, that's fair. I just don't think we should lose sight of the speed argument, because probably one of the greatest things that British Rail ever achieved, and the pioneer, one of the very first power cars, is here. When the HSTs were introduced in 1976, and we went for a railway that was probably, I think in Europe, we ran more trains at 125 miles an hour than anywhere else. The uplift in terms of revenue and growth was very significant.
I think none of my argument is an argument against speed where you can get it at relatively good value. And I think the challenge you had with HS2, right, is that on sections of the network, particularly at the ends of the network, where you're going to be stopping and then making a relatively short journey. So one example would be if you were stopping at Manchester Airport and going into Piccadilly. Well, at that point, by the time you stop that train, how fast are you ever really going to get? And that was part of the original argument about when Northern Powerhouse Rail was first promised or offered, it was called HS2. But obviously, lots of people would make a very good argument that says, looking at those northern cities, a high-speed solution is just not the right answer because they're all far too close together for that to ever really be the right answer. It's just that we need something a bit faster than we have now. But Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade might buy you a little bit more speed, but it certainly doesn't buy you much capacity. Do you mean it buys you an extra stopping train between Manchester and Leeds, one extra fast train? It's incredibly valuable because it will give that network resilience, it decarbonises journeys across the Pennines, and that is all good value to the taxpayer and to passengers and to the northern economy. But it doesn't deliver you that transformation journeys that we would need to change people's behaviour.
Agreed.
The scale we need.
Here's my heresy, Henry. I mean, it needs to have a lot of value because at 11 billion or 10 or 11 billion pounds, it's costing a lot of money to do that Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. I want to ask you about rail reform, and importantly, rail reform in the context of the English Devolution White Paper, because when we read the consultation that Heidi Alexander put out recently, I mean, I have to say, I thought it was a good document. I know there's a huge amount of detail that everybody still wants to see, but as a direction or as a signposting thing, I thought it was very powerful. There was a very interesting bit in it that said, we're going to have more devolved powers to local leaders, to combined authorities, metro mayors. But by the way, don't forget, I mean, I'm paraphrasing now, don't forget it's a network, it's a national network, and everything has to fit within the context of that national network. It was almost like, so don't get carried away. When you read the English Devolution White Paper that the Deputy Prime Minister is sponsoring, it's stronger language when it comes to transportation, right? Much, you will have these powers. Have we got a potential kind of almost like intra-government, conflict's probably too strong a word, but do you think it's joined up? And which is the bit that's
going to win?
That's going to win.
I mean, I think my reflection would be, and I have some sympathy, right, with the national network issue, which is that as much as I want Andy to have GM Rail and have integrated public transport in Greater Manchester, many of those journeys don't start in Greater Manchester. They start in Blackpool or they start in Cheshire. And those people live in the north of England too, right? And I'd quite like more people who live in Blackpool to consider a job in Manchester, thank you very much. So we don't want to put those people off or leave those services being worse than they are today. My reflection would be, as much as fares and ticketing can absolutely be probably devolved significantly to metro mayors, those decisions about who and how do we prioritise services across the north of England, how do we make the right decisions in terms of electrification, in terms of prioritising rolling stock and avoiding buying new diesel trains that we don't really need, for example. Who should do that? Well, I don't think within the level of a city region you really can. So I'm very open to the work of my colleagues at the Urban Transport Group who've thought about these issues, and obviously they are passionate believers in the role of local transport authorities. They are the people who largely have the experience of running passenger services. They are ultimately the people who are going to drive fares and ticketing reform. But those decisions about who prioritises which journey, how we improve the network to get more journeys that travel beyond travel to work areas. And I always think of the example of people who live between Sheffield and Manchester, who live in Derbyshire, but in every geographical definition are northern. They use northern trains that run to cities like Manchester and a few run to Sheffield. Those people have a right to be thought about as well. And if they live in the commuter market of Manchester, it's not in Manchester's interest to prioritise the interests of people who live in Manchester above people who commute into Manchester. And as long as we do rail reform in such a way that we're looking at growing the number of people who can travel into an urban area rather than simply improving it for people who live in that urban area and want to travel around it, we'll be in the right place. And I think the Greater Manchester model, which for example will bring some Hope Valley stations into that system, is exactly the right approach. But if you look at the history of West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, for example, why is it so much cheaper to go to Huddersfield but so much more expensive to then travel to any station in Greater Manchester? Well, the history of PTEs and how local rail fares were worked out, and it's still baked into the national fare system that it's unreasonably expensive to travel across a political boundary in the north of England. That shows the dangers of when there are unintended consequences of making it easier to travel within a region
Yeah.
and making it harder to travel to the neighbouring region.
Yeah.
We can't do that. And I think that's what, to be fair to the Department for Transport, I'm not always being that fair to the DFT, but I think their emphasis in the consultation is alluding to that problem rather than being against doing the things that can be done at that level.
I think you're right. And I actually am reasonably positive about this. I have a look at how it works with TfL and their relationship in London and the South East. Sensible people, as a rule, get to sensible decisions.
Yeah.
Brighton Main Line's a great example. TfL got it wanted on inner suburban services. We still got a good service on the Brighton Main Line. They worked together. They fixed it. And I'm sure that will be the same. But just one sort of final big...
And the reliability was better, right?
And absolutely. No. And that's always been Peter Henry's point as well. Final sort of big question. Really. One of the things that slightly concerns me, I'm sure many others, is as we see metro mayors, combined authorities, local authorities getting more control over specification, is this almost like a plethora of almost like quangos and public bodies, and a real risk of sort of public sector domination. How, given your role is fundamentally a business-led advocacy group, how do we make sure that the skills and the benefits that the private sector brings, not just to policy, but also to doing these things and funding these things, whether it's tax incremental financing or land value capture, whatever it is, how do we make sure the private sector can participate in this and it just doesn't become a bureaucratic sort of like, I'm not even sure what the word is, monolith?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's not churlish for me to say, and I'm sure my good friend Andy Bagnall, who's done a great job leading Rail Partners and obviously now moving on to other things, it's not unfair to observe that the government answer for bus is essentially a model which it is abolishing in the railway. So it's just a statement of fact that we are bringing in franchising for buses, and we're essentially getting rid of a model that is a bit like franchising in the rail industry. I don't think that the best argument for reforming the rail industry is actually getting rid of the private sector involvement. I think the best argument is that having lots of railway companies has in some cases led to bad decision making and not getting the full efficiency out of the system. And so if you take a non-ideological position, I can make a non-ideological argument for why I think that the solution that the government have come to is the right one, although I wouldn't justify it in the terms that they use. I think that simplifying the railway unfortunately means there isn't a role for the private sector in the way it was before, but there will be a different role for the private sector. And I do think when you look at the current role that's been attributed to Roscoe's, there are some, I think, relevant arguments about whether that model delivers best value for the taxpayer. I think we can make much longer term leasing decisions about rolling stock, particularly if you're not going to require them to constantly be working with new operators all the time who are on fixed term deals from government about running a service. If you can allocate a piece of rolling stock to an area of track for 10, 20 years, rather than having deals which require paying a premium for the ability to offload that rolling stock at any point, I think that potentially could deliver a lot of value. So in some areas we need to change the
Roscoe
relationship.
can still do that.
Yeah,
yeah
they can do.
Yeah.
But I think you could argue that the current Roscoe leasing models are not delivering as much value for the taxpayer as they could do. And they're such an important and significant part of the cost of the railway, you can't ignore Roscoe's, right? So you want a different relationship with the people who provide the rolling stock than the one you have now. You're not going to have the relationship with the private sector to operate the services day to day anymore. Well, what's the new role for the private sector? Well, I would argue that the predominant role for the private sector in the railway industry will be investing in and building new railway lines. I think that is something the private sector could and should get involved in. I think developing stations and managing stations has been identified as an area that the railway hasn't made best impact on in the last few years, partly because Network Rail has been kept in a very tight leash by the Treasury and doesn't have a lot of financial freedom. So I don't think that's really a criticism of Network Rail. I think it's just a function of the fact that a body that's kept that close to Treasury is not necessarily the best people to make entrepreneurial business decisions about realising the maximum value of assets. And I think that I don't see the local transport bodies who are doing this service specification as really being the sort of quandocracy that NHS England is, because I think a lot of the private sector are quite keen actually on the people in their local area and the wider region around them being able to get to their place of work. If I open a factory or I run an airport or I have an office in a big city centre or a lab, I'm quite interested in the fact people can get to work every day, because that's a key factor in them being prepared to move or stay in that city and work in my organisation. And so I don't think anyone looks at Transport for Greater Manchester and goes, why on earth do we need that? I think everyone who lives in Greater Manchester thinks you need that. Even Andrea Jenkins, the Reform candidate for Mayor of Lincolnshire, not someone I would consider I often have a lot to praise, even though she doesn't want to franchise the buses, she still wants to create Transport for Lincolnshire to reopen disused railway lines. I'm sure Peter, Henry and others could give her a lesson on quite how expensive and troublesome that might end up being. But my argument is that if you're, even politicians who have very limited aspirations around public transport, understand the idea that in a local area, somebody needs to be in charge of transport.
Yeah.
And if that is going to be the public sector, they need to have the right skills and expertise to do it properly. I think what we will see, however, is that in the new railway, if we're going to get rid of private companies running the services, which is now what's going to happen, for better or worse, we will see in the long term whether people like me who make a non-ideological argument are right, whether the government who make an ideological argument, whether they're right. But what is interesting to me is that the DfT have a lot of civil servants who work on the rail industry, who are responsible for managing these very complicated, contractually driven processes. And now we're going to get rid of those processes, right? So we don't need all those people. So I'm not just interested in how efficient are the bits of TOCs that have now become publicly managed and run, like TPE or Northern. I'm also interested in how many people are working in central government as civil servants, managing this network. Because particularly considering that they were so terrible at managing Network Rail in a silo and managing the operating companies in a different silo, and often would be accepting tenders from companies which presumed infrastructure which the government hadn't been funding and had no plan to fund. And there were lots of examples of that at Leeds Station and other places where assumptions were made built into contracts that just didn't exist, right? Because the DfT just hadn't joined the paperwork at their own end to understand the mismatch in expectations of what will be delivered and what was actually going to be built. And I think for me, the full benefits of rail nationalisation only come when, as I alluded to, you get down the cost of leasing trains and make longer term decisions, you reduce the number of civil servants at the DfT, and finally, you get genuine behaviour change and modal shift through integrated ticketing at the local level. Those are three things we can actually quite quickly do. And if GBR can deliver those in its first couple of years, then I think it will genuinely be seen to be delivering value for the taxpayer. And then it will get the trust from government and the Treasury to be able to do some of those bolder things that we know it needs to do to genuinely make the network out there look a bit less like the network in this shed. Because if you want a modern future railway, much of what is still out there is not what we need. And that is going to have to change, and that has to be paid for somehow. And the only way to pay for that long-term sustainably is either through higher taxes and or revenue growth. And that's got to be delivered in a way that's not going to stifle the economy, and that means that you can't keep putting up fares indefinitely. Yeah. You have to genuinely deliver value to passengers.
So, very final question. Agree with all of that, by the way.
Mother and apple pie.
I was going to say, you were playing to the gallery there, but it was brilliant. Final question. When I was sort of thinking about what we're going to chat about, 48 hours ago, I thought, all right, well, you know, we're on looking at potential global recession with all these tariffs going on. I woke up this morning and all the tariffs are off now. Yeah, I mean, you just kind of couldn't make it up, really. But what it does mean is everything's uncertain. Everything's ever so slightly chaotic. We know the Chancellor's facing a really difficult spending review. There's no two ways about that. Can we be optimistic? Or because I worry that this spending review is going to be so tough on transport that quite a lot of the momentum we're building, whether it's with devolution or whether it's with Great British Rails, whatever it is, could end up just getting a bit sort of stopped in its tracks.
The one positive I would think back on is that, remember, back in the autumn, we changed the spending rules, right? It was something our chair, Jim O'Neill, was incredibly keen that we did. And the reason why we as an organisation were so committed to helping him convince the Chancellor of that was that the capital budget for the railway is not under as much constraint as it otherwise would have done. And I would argue that could and should we find ways through the nationalisation process and through the establishment of GBR to take some cost out of the way we run the railway? Should we be doing things as dramatic as the closure of NHS England that West Streeting has argued? Well, I'm arguing for a reverse version of that. I'm arguing for GBR to make the DfT a lot smaller rather than the Department of Health to get bigger and have a smaller GBR. But it's the same principle.
It's the
right?
same, absolutely. Yeah.
You don't need two people doing the same job. And we've won the argument that those people who run a railway, that in the end is a profit-making business, should be a profit-making business. And it is on the West Coast. It is largely on the East Coast. It could be a much more profit-making business on other routes as well. If we want to do that, then where that naturally takes you in terms of your thinking is, we're going to take out some revenue costs, but we're going to protect capital. And you look at those key projects in the north that mean we get the most of that 11 billion for Trans-Pennine Route upgrades. And actually you don't get the full value of Trans-Pennine Route upgrades, the genuinely additional benefits above the kind of base case ones, unless you sort out Oxford Road Station, sort out Piccadilly Station, sort out Leeds Station, do some investment there. Well, there's some more capital there in the next 3 years that we're going to have to win the case for. So I think the deal that the railway system has to make with government is, we need more investment. If we want to accelerate East-West Rail, which government may very well want to do, can we attract private investment, for example, to stations? The same way that we in the north are looking at private investment funding and financing solutions as part of all of our considerations. And so if you can come up with a plan that says, right, we're going to do East-West Rail because we're committed to do that. We're going to do Trans-Pennine Route upgrades because we're committed to do that. We're going to do all the other things we're committed to do. We're going to do these extra bits where mayors and business organisations like us can make a really good case that it fits with those strategic priorities. We're probably not going to do huge amounts else in capital projects in the railway. We're going to have to accept the fact that it's not a shopping list that's completely unending. There is going to be a limit to it.
Sure.
And if there is pain, it probably comes in the way we manage day-to-day services. And what we want to avoid, of course, is taking out costs that we don't want to have to take out. So if you can, for example, really push hard on leasing costs and change the way we finance the trains in this country. And there are disruptors, right? Rockrail and others who've argued very vociferously that the current way we finance rolling stock is not in the long-term interest of the railway. Well, let's do those things, right? Rather than cut the number of services we send to Workington or to Whitehaven every day. Because that's the choice that we're going to face as a rail industry. Do the systemic hard stuff that actually delivers long-term value for taxpayers, or salami slice non-core routes on the northern network, where already it's pretty derisory service, and make it even worse. And I would much rather take on potentially established interests who like the way things are done now and make genuine change in the industry that delivers a fairer outcome for all parties and gives long-term certainty to that industry, that they can continue to buy and sell rolling stock, knowing and lease it, knowing exactly what the rules of the game are. For me, that's the stuff we need to think about doing. And I think GBR needs to be bold, whoever ends up leading the organisation, to do those things and do them early, rather than do the stuff that Treasury would love to do, right? Treasury would commission a report every week telling how many railways they could shut, Beeching Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. Treasury could write that report for you every day of the week. But you look at the success of the Northumberland line, right? And you look at the opportunity of connecting places to the rail network. And I would argue that even loss-making bits of the railway, routes that are not commercial to run, deliver real social value. So if I want to protect that social value, I'm going to have to make really hard decisions to deliver the value that pays for that, because there isn't going to be more taxpayers' money to pay for that.
Well, now you've won over just about everybody that listens to this programme, so thank you for that. Like every time...
Started off unpopular, finished on a high.
I totally agree. Well, that's a great way to finish, isn't it, rather than the other way around. Every time we speak, Henry, I find it interesting, I find it thought-provoking, but as a northerner myself, I find it really quite positive and exciting, and that's a great way to end it. Henri Murison, Chief Executive of Northern Powerhouse, thank you so much for your time, and we'll no doubt speak again post the spending review. We may have to sort of review some of this stuff, but for now, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me back.